to take a look at the modern history of education. Um, kind of see where we are now and look at more of the education that you've experienced and that your parents have experienced in theirs. So we've got some words we want to get through. Baby boom, I'm assuming at this point your junior, senior year, having been through this, you guys have heard of the baby boom. So that was the great increase in births after the end of World War II. All the GIs came home. And they made babies. My parents are baby boomers. Some of you, your grandparents could be in that cusp of baby boomers. Depending on if your parents are the oldest in the family. So like I'm the oldest child that my parents had, so I have baby boomer parents. If your parents happen to be some of the youngest in their family, then your grandparents might not be part of that baby boomer era. Project Head Start is the federal government program to help preschool children from low-income families get skills they need for kindergarten. Now, some of this stems from some of the stuff we talked in the last chapter, where you still had segregated schools. You didn't have separate but equal by any means. And even when those schools that did integrate, it wasn't done well. And so you would find some of these low-income families not able to provide their children the exposure that they would need for kindergarten, whether it's social skills or academic skills even. If the parents don't know that they need this skill, they're not able to work with their kids on it. So I can remember working with my kids on learning their colors, recognizing some letters. So this is where that Project Head Start comes from. If we talk about bilingual education, it simply means an education in two languages. And bilingual education has definitely transformed over the years. I feel like bilingual education started as a way to help non-English speakers have access to education. But it's also kind of taking a different approach. Friends of mine, their grandchildren up in Grand Rapids did a Spanish immersion school. And so they did all of their learning in Spanish. They were English-speaking students, but they were doing all of their school and elementary school in Spanish. And so these two young ladies now, I think by the ages of probably 9, 10, were very fluent in the Spanish language just because they were immersed in it. So that bilingual education can look both ways. The term illiterate means unable to read or write. And so that was what was happening in some of the lower income families at the time. You had two parents that were illiterate. The Back to Basics movement. And so we're going to transition through the decades here in this modern education. In one of the decades, there was a huge swing for the back to basics. There were some studies done, some reports, and so the decision was to move towards focusing on the teaching of basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. And so they'll say teaching or education is cyclic or has a cycle to it. So when we looked at chapter 6, that was the focus of those McGuffey readers. They focused on the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. So when we realized that we were testing and falling behind other countries, we said we need to focus on these things. We'll let art, we'll let history, we'll let science kind of go on the wayside and get these basics really strong. And those of you who are in the early elementary classrooms, those 3 topics make up the majority of the day. They have their big ELA block, they have their reading, they have their journaling and writing, and they have their math block. Science and social studies get thrown in where it can. All of our kids do have access to music and PE, so we are a district that is fortunate to have that. The global economy is just the interconnection of economies around the world. And that's done through financing and trade. So we know China has a huge impact on the global market because of the strong, I think it's the yen over there. I should have checked that before coming over here, or before starting here. But the strong control they have across the world. And so that's what makes us a global economy. Educational standards. These are sometimes known as instructional goals, what students are expected to know at specific points in education. And those are often set by a national board. Each subject area is going to have a national board once you get past elementary. So there's early elementary, there's primary, and there's upper primary when we take a look at dividing up pre-K and K, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then when you start to get into the secondary. But the educational standards is where we want students to be. National standards is what is going to be taught and mastered in specific subject areas. Now, to be honest, ladies and gentlemen, I went through and looked at the reading quiz. I did one of the online study reviews. Educational standards and national standards are two things that I even get mixed up. So the educational is what students are learning. National standards are what we're going to tell the teachers to teach. Now, should those be highly connected? For sure. Because if I want a kid to be here, you've got to know how to teach it. But the educational standards is what they're going to learn. The same thing, those are all designed by boards, but often there's a lot of autonomy in what is being taught. Competency-based education, and this is still a big term being used. We started using it in education around the time of No Child Left Behind. And so if you're going to have a competency-based education, that means you're going to require students to demonstrate their abilities in a subject area. Probably 8 years ago, there was a talk that the state would create an end-of-course test for Algebra 1, Geometry, and Algebra 2. That would be an example of competency-based education. So I would no longer be able to say, Elena is competent in algebra, or Nalia is competent in algebra as their Algebra 1 teachers, but the test from the state would decide, are they competent? And so it does create a difference in how you're teaching, because now my teaching is no longer catered to my students, it's catered to this test. And so there's a lot of pros and cons behind a competency-based education. Accountability is just proving that your standards are being made and being met. So my sisters who teach elementary school in Florida, their students have to go online and take an online testing, and this is kindergartners and first graders, to prove that my sisters are teaching what they're supposed to. That's the accountability factor. I, on the other hand, up here, get to hand out a pre-test that I create, my students take it. I get to then hand out a post-test that I make, that my students take, and that proves my accountability. Flaws in both systems, but in either case, there's a way to prove the teacher is teaching what they're supposed to and that students are learning it. But that's what accountability means. Standardized tests. Tests that measure students' performance compared to thousands of others. So probably one of the most common examples is the M-STEP that you guys have taken throughout elementary school, comparing you to thousands of students in the state of Michigan. And then the SAT, which is going to compare you to thousands of students across the nation. Charter schools, and we do have one or two in the area. It's a public school, but it runs under a charter, and a charter is an agreement between a corporation and the state, which allows them a company to run the school versus a local school board. And so the way public schools in Michigan are set up is that the local school board runs that. And those of you who have been to the school board meeting, you've met our school board. They're the ones who have to make the decisions. Monday night, they just made a decision that we are not going to open up school of choice for second semester. So they make a lot of decisions on those sorts of things. Where now it's a corporation that comes in, and the company that comes in might not even be based in the community. So they don't necessarily have any ties to the people, and so that was one of the flaws that that happens there. And also what happens is there's not for many of the regulations that we have to follow as a school, and there are a ton of regulations. There's regulations on who can teach what. There's regulations on what money can be spent on what. They talked about, oh, I can't remember what the topic was, but I heard Mr. Freeman talk about the sinking fund versus this. I mean, we have different pools of money and how they can spend that, but charter schools are exempt from a lot of those. And then career clusters. In the 80s and 90s, there were 16 general career areas that had a wide range of related opportunities. So you guys, when you fill out like your class schedule each year, remember you have like your career pathway or your do they just call it pathway, or is it career pathway that you choose? And like you might be choosing health and human services, you might be choosing business. Those are part of that career cluster. Meredith.
So like for accountability, if like a lot of students like fail like post-test or whatever, like what happens to the teacher?
So like in my sister's, down where my sisters live, they get marked down on their evaluation. And so 50% of their evaluation is student performance, and 50% is their principal evaluating their teaching. So that means half of their evaluation would be pretty poor. And so then when it comes time to determine what teachers are going to be laid off, which teachers are going to be surplus, that would put them in lower rankings and they would start to lose their job. Here in Michigan, our student performance piece, which is that accountability, is only maybe 20%. So the other 80% is still your teacher performance. So we still can look pretty good on paper, but it's the same thing. If my student performance part starts to drop and Ms. Ricci's is really high, if it comes time to lay off someone, because my accountability portion is lower, she would get her job over mine. So that accountability comes into play usually only when there's a need to lay off. Now, when we talk about like getting rid of teachers, it has to do with accountability and behavior. So that evaluation side also has to be low. Because there are times, and you guys may be seeing this at the elementaries, certain classrooms have a lot of really needy students, and other classrooms don't have as many. So to base every single year on just that group of students' accountability is really hard, especially like at the kindergarten or early elementary level. So they usually aren't going to make quick decisions of eliminating a teacher based on just 1 year's performance. But if they had to lay off a teacher because enrollment goes down, that accountability is what would kind of make the difference between those. Yeah, it is kind of scary. And I will say my sister had to move grade level. My one sister had to change grade levels because her student test performance in 3rd grade was the lowest out of all the 3rd grade teachers in her building. And do we have anyone who's in 3rd grade? Lauren, you're in 3rd grade, aren't you? There's a big movement right now that in 3rd grade, every student has to read or they would be retained. There's a big reading initiative. And so because my sister was at that critical grade of 3rd grade and her scores weren't high enough, she had to go teach 1st grade. And so it's kind of scary that those pieces, but she hadn't been doing a good job of 3rd grade for a couple of years. So even though that's bad of me to say, I think it was a good move for her to get out of 3rd grade. All right, so now we're going to look at the 40s and 50s. Sorry, I feel like I'm saying that about my sister, and I'm even recording it. Now, in my sister's defense, guys, her husband is schizophrenic and has been hospitalized for quite a while, so she has some emotional things going on too. But I think. All right, so what was going on in the 40s and 50s? The World War II veterans were coming back and attending college or gaining, that should be a trade, guys. I'm sorry about that. Gaining a trade. Let's change school to trade through the GI Bill. My dad came back from Vietnam and he finished up his bachelor's a master's and was 2 classes away from having his second master's off a GI Bill. Unfortunately, due to some of the global economy factors, the GI Bill isn't quite as healthy as it used to be. There was a huge surge in birth rate, and we're seeing the ripple effects now when we talk about Social Security and providing for those baby boomers. And so as those, 5 years later, those kids needed a place to go, and so they were entering public schools, causing a need for more schools and teachers. And so my dad's aunts and uncles, so that generation just before his baby boom, there are 5 of his 9 aunts and uncles were teachers. I think 6 of them had teaching certificates. And so that became a really a strong need, and a lot of people went into it. How did we keep America competitive with the Soviet Union? Because after World War II, we're dealing with the Cold War. And so that was who we were competing with. Now no longer so much competing with the Soviet Union, but other nations. So Congress passed what was called the National Defense Education Act. So the idea was we needed to be able to defend ourselves against the Russians. And how are we going to do that? Well, we're going to create really smart kids who can keep up with the arms creation and what was changing there. We've just watched Einstein's bombs, and so looking through those. So to do that, we have to make monies available for science. That wasn't necessarily one of those things. So science had to be improved. They needed to be able to provide scholarships because not every student was able to go to college. And so now we wanted to make sure that not just the rich were getting there, but we were getting the best and the brightest. And just because you are bright doesn't mean you have money. Schools were encouraged to sharpen math and science education, so increase the rigor there. And homework requirements increased. Well, how else are you going to get smart unless you do a lot of it, right? So we needed more homework. That was just the reaction. At the same time, we've got Brown versus the Board of Education. And we don't spend a lot of time talking about this, but more the fact that that is where segregation was determined. It was unconstitutional. Separate was not equal anymore. So some districts did go ahead and desegregate, but they used some delay tactics. And unfortunately, like I said, because this isn't necessarily history, those delay tactics aren't described. I started to do a little bit of looking up. Some of it had to do with bringing them in to the school, but you might see that, oh, all the black kids are in the same second-hour math class. Oh, how did that happen? So you still kept them separate. And when we talk about like accountability, Meredith, you might put one of your worst teachers with them. So schools were integrating them, but they weren't bringing them into giving them the exact same education as everyone. So they started looking a little bit more at psychology and its play in school, because the number of students we have in school is increasing. The way we're wanting to teach kids and get kids to do things is changing. So now we've got to kind of look at these different methods. So behaviorism, as we saw earlier in the year, was based on B.F. Skinner. And because how you behave is determined by your experiences, we want behavior and achievement that is good to be rewarded. And then we have to start punishing the things that are not, because we want you to have a really positive experience with the good things. We want you to have a negative experience with the bad things. And so back then, at this time, they still were allowed to use corporal punishment. Swatting kids on the hand, on the buttocks. I don't know if you'd slap a kid in the face, I don't know. My dad had none. My mom doesn't talk about it. My mom was probably a pretty good student. My dad, a pretty good kid. My dad talks about it, but he had none, and it was a lot of, they would hit him on the hands with rulers, regardless of what they were doing. So that was theirs. But then you started to reward things. So you guys see that in the classrooms that you're in. We still use that. You get sticker charts. Brady was super excited because he got 9 stickers on his sticker chart because he had a clean bin at school. So we still use those rewards because that is kind of, that behaviorism is ours. All right. Looking at the 1960s, these baby boomers became teens and young adults, and this is where we start to see that hippie mentality. We're challenging the values and policies, really starting to question, not being just conformists anymore. The civil rights movement is what became active during that time, and schools and teachers had the freedom to try new things. Because we're starting to integrate more math and science, and we want to create thinkers, in order to do that, we have to allow teachers to do thinking activities. And then during this time, the federal government recognized the need to get involved, so there's policies to help the disadvantaged. And so we've already had a couple of those mentioned in our vocab, so we'll see those. Guys, I know I went a little fast there. You may have to go back to that screen online on your own. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, this formally outlawed segregation. So this is no longer a state-by-state case. This is the federal government. So schools were ordered to end, and now we have federal guidelines were issued on how to do it. So that inequality that we saw earlier, or those delay tactics, were now banned. And we start to see some new techniques come into place. The Elementary and Secondary Act of 1965. So this is an act that has been rewritten a number of times, and I think the acronym has changed a little bit. But what this was looking to do was to improve the schools most in need. So we're looking at where are our schools behind the most, and so we're going to find those in areas where we have poorer communities, our urban, bigger cities. So the areas like Detroit, Chicago, the big cities out east would have been given federal money based on the number of poor students that they had, so that schools could use resources and find resources to bring them up to a common level, because that's what we were meant to do, was we were meant to equalize education. So this was back in 1965. Part of that was this Project Head Start, and we already talked about that. It helped preschoolers from economically poor families. So that was the focus. Since then, Project Head Start has broadened its umbrella. So I can remember one of the kids that my daughter went to daycare with when they were little qualified for like a Head Start program because her dad had recently died. And so that trauma in her life qualified her for this federal program because they knew that a big event like that, a major event in their life, could then cause problems for education. My son, who was in early on for speech therapy starting before he was even 2 years old, he qualified for a Head Start program because he had a speech delay. So this umbrella of Head Start to get everyone ready for kindergarten and school broadened over time. In the 70s, There was a lot of foreign and domestic preoccupations. Well, what does that mean? We were dealing with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and all of the domestic side that went with those things. You look at, we've come off the shooting of JFK, of Robert Kennedy. We're looking at the assassinations of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. We've had all this unrest, and this domestic these domestic problems and these foreign policies are preoccupying what's going on. There was less disposable income. We're getting ready to go into that high inflation of the 1970s. And so if there's less disposable income, there's less money that the government can collect from you on your taxes. Which means that the government's not collecting a lot of money, there's less money to spend on education. And at that time, local schools were still funded by just local money. So if Stevensville all of a sudden had a huge, hard economic turn, there isn't a lot of money in Stevensville anymore to support education. And so you saw pockets of this going around the nation as that disposable income became less and less. And so schools suffered from a lack of funding. At this time, they had segregation and busing became prevalent. And so we're still working on that integration. But because you do have pockets of cultural pockets around an area, all of your blacks are going to live together in an area. All of your Hispanics, your Asians, your whites are all going to live close together, which meant when you go to school, you're going to have a white school, you're going to have a black school, you're going to have a Hispanic school, even though you're meant to integrate them and not have segregation. It was just happening by the borders of the school. And so to force integration, students were assigned to school districts. And so that would be like saying, we're going to send a third of Benton Harbor to Lakeshore, we're going to send a third of Benton Harbor to St. Joe, we're going to send a third of Lakeshore to St. Joe, and we're going to send a third of Lakeshore to Benton Harbor. And now we're going to integrate those three schools. And so to do that, they bus students to neighboring schools to get that integration. The plan was very controversial, as you can imagine, as many of you kind of raised an eyebrow at me when I suggested doing that. But that's what integration looked like. There was busing at this time. Ms. Kelly used to work in Coloma, and it was after the 70s, and they would bus students from Benton Harbor to Coloma. It wasn't school of choice. It was these students are going to be assigned to attend school in Coloma, and they were bused there by the Coloma School District to force that integration. Bilingual education, this is where it said, hey, if your kid doesn't speak English, you need to make sure that you provide them school in their, provide them the English classes to learn English. So we're not necessarily saying, oh, you speak Spanish, so I'm going to give you a Spanish resource, but we're going to take the time during the day to teach you English. And so you're going to, kind of like a head start, you're going to give them what they need to learn. Gender equity or equality, that is has two names, and I know it as Title IX, and I refer to it as Title IX, but you guys are going to want to recognize it as also the Equal Opportunity in Education Act. And so what that does is it goes beyond just equity for females, it's equity for everyone. And it goes beyond sports. But that's a lot of what happened there. Sports were open to girls. My mom is old enough that she can remember a time when there were no sports for girls besides cheerleading. Now, she went to a big school in the Denver area, so they did have gymnastics, only because she lived in a big metropolitan area. Those of you, your grandparents went to school here in Stevensville or Baroda, they didn't have gymnastics in the school, I'm sure of that. And they might not have even had cheerleading for the girls, but if they did have a sport, it would have stopped at cheerleading. Before this, they didn't even let them run track. And in order to do that, if we're going to pass an Equal Opportunities Education Act, the federal government better stand behind it. So they gave money to help implement those things. Because some schools need to build another locker room, right, guys? so they need money to change their facilities, support having male and female athletes. My mom can remember having to be in a gym class. I don't think in some of the smaller schools, like where my dad went to school, I don't think their girls even took PE class. Guess what they took? Parenting, home ec, sewing, cooking. So they didn't need a girls' locker room in there because the girls didn't need to change for gym class. Children with disabilities. So we should see a common theme here in the 70s, guys. We're trying to work on getting everyone access to education. Anyone that has something that's keeping them from accessing that full experience. So this was called the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. Were you guys with me the day that Mr. Freeman brought someone in to look at the classroom? Or was that another? Some of you were here. She had to come in because I'm a CTE class. My class has to be accessible to all handicapped students. So she had to make sure that the door was wide enough for a wheelchair to fit through and that the desk would accommodate a wheelchair. So I remember the one comment she made. She's like, oh, they're wide and they're adjustable so that if a student had a raised wheelchair that the desk could be raised for them to go under. And that's part of this act. Now the other part is it created the least restricted environment. Alyssa's in the cognitively impaired room at Stewart. And so those are the students who do not learn the same way. They have a low IQ, and that's how they're identified. Those students before this would not have been allowed in a public school. They would have had to go to a like a Berry and Risa. They would have to go to a separate school, or they might not even go to school because what are they going to learn? And that was the attitude. And so now it said they deserve to be in the school. They deserve to have to be part of the regular classroom. So Alyssa's class goes to music, correct? And they get to experience music. And all this came about from the beginning of these acts. To me, it's kind of weird to think of it, guys, because it's always been that way since you've been there, correct? But for a long time, these kids never came into a public school building. 1980s. We have a much smaller emphasis on education. The economic gaps widen. Reagan's trickle-down economics. Those of you who have gotten a chance to study that in econ, or if you're your social studies teachers, give their view on that. And so if the economic gap is widening, naturally the education gap widens. There's no way to keep that from happening. The divorce rate rose, thus there were more single parents. 5 parents moved the very end of the 80s. We moved out of the small town that my dad had grown up in and that his dad had grown up in. And all of my friends, their parents had grown up in that same town and their grandparents had grown up in that same town. And I can remember we were gone for about 2 years, and all of a sudden, all my friends' parents got divorced. It was like the weird, I shouldn't say all, like there were a couple of them that same year, but it was really weird. Like all of a sudden, these parents just started getting divorced, and this was the late 80s. For a long time, you had people staying married because that's what you did, and now all of a sudden it was like, nope, we're going to be happy. We're going to get divorced. But what happened? Why does that impact education? Because now you have more single parents. And the more single parents you have, the more difficult it is to give kids the support at home that they were used to getting when there were 2 parents. When homes are divorced and you have kids going back and forth, it just creates a different type of thing that teachers have to respond to. And so we were seeing that impact there. The other thing we see after that Title IX, women are gaining career opportunities. So I talked about that back to basics movement in the vocab. The study that was published was called A Nation at Risk. And what it did is it put a very lovely visual on, here's the number of kids that start school. Here are the number of kids that are in high school. These are the number of kids that graduate from high school. And these are the number of kids who actually get a degree. And so you saw this inverted triangle, and it scared everyone. Because what was going on with our education system? We had been hands-off for a while throughout the 80s, and all of a sudden we see that states can't really do it. Educating children is such a big expense that we need to do it. And so the response was, we need everyone reading, doing math, and writing. We don't want a bunch of illiterates. I don't feel like we talk about that much anymore, but when I was in school, guys, it talked about how many people were illiterate. I don't know if we don't have as many illiterate people, or if we just hide it a lot better and we don't talk about it. In the 90s, internet was the key role. Guys, if your hand hurts, just take a break and listen, and you can copy them down because they are online. I know I feel really bad on these days because I see some of you shaking your hands out. But realize I will put it up online, and you can fill it out throughout the week as you go. So the economy starts booming. Unemployment is at an all-time low. We had a lot of industry and corporations gaining money in the 80s. And so what that did is it created jobs. And so we had low unemployment. But in 2008, the financial crisis made us financially unsure or insecure. I never at any point thought my husband and I would lose our jobs because we were teachers, but my husband's two brothers were engineers for GM, and for a long time we weren't sure what was going to happen to them, and one of them did lose their job with GM. Fortunately, he found a job with FedEx, but had to move to Memphis, Tennessee. But that time was pretty scary, and some of you may have had parents that were affected by that. And so now this is when we see our global economy. And that affects our finance and trade, and we still see that. The computer revolution, computer programs were developed, and so that's how my sisters get their accountability down in Florida. They put their kids on an online test, and they take that online test. My one sister got a gold star because she had the most iReady time that month out of first grade. So her kids had spent the most time on the computer. Isn't that something to be proud of? But they were. She got a special little bundle from her principal of like Cocos and lotions because she had those kids on the computer. I don't know about that. The declining price allowed them to become available in homes. Many of you probably don't remember not having a computer in your home. You probably don't remember not having multiple computers in your home. And in the internet and search engines turned computers into that educational tool. I grew up with two different sets of encyclopedias in my basement. We had an older set from when my dad was younger, and then he bought us a newer set. We were kids, and we'd run down to the basement and look things up in the encyclopedia. We'd bring the encyclopedia up to the dinner table and look things up. Now we do that looking at our phones, and we can research so much more. And computer skills become a career skill to be taught in school. I am proud to admit that I did take typing on a typewriter, and I took computer literacy on a computer. So I am young and old enough to have experienced both of those things. So now we're in those accountability. We wanted to have an objective way to evaluate learning. So much of education is subjective, and it should be, because I should be meeting a student where they're at, but we still need to be objective. We also wanted to be able to evaluate curriculums and technology. Not only are we evaluating what the kids are learning, but then we need to go back and look and see, okay, is it that the kids aren't being taught well, or the tools that we're giving the teachers are bad? So we needed to be able to evaluate both. And in order to do that, we had to develop standardized tests. When we look at our standardized test scores, we compare gender, we compare race, we compare socioeconomic. There's another one that we compare. I can't remember what the other one is. But you have that data. So we can compare them within our groups, and then we also compare schools. We look and see, how did St. Joe do? How did Bridgman do? We'll look and see how some of the Detroit schools did that are similar in size and similar in demographic, meaning they have a similar, when we look at free and reduced lunches, the percentage of free and reduced lunches, the percentage of minorities. So we're comparing ourselves to schools in different areas of the state. George H. Bush, the one we buried last week. So our early president established 6 educational goals to be reached by 2000. I could not find in my resources what those 6 educational goals were, and I did not go online to look for those. But part of the reason that I couldn't find much, guys, is that last statement there. There was little time to analyze and fix the problems. So basically it was, here's the goals, now go figure it out. Well, I'm teaching all day long. When do I figure this stuff out? And so they kind of realized that implementing things that way doesn't work at all. And so we'll stop at 33, guys. The other 2 aren't as important. But No Child Left Behind is how we fixed that Goals 2000. George W. Bush came in and did that educational reform. Obama's followed up with it, with what he did in his 8 years. It was still very controversial because every student was expected to reach those targets at a specific time. And one of my favorite things to say is, all kids are gifted, they just open them at different times. And so you guys should see that in your classroom, and hopefully you notice it. Elena was telling a story about the young lady she works with finally getting something from the beginning of the year to the end of the year, or where she's at right now, like she's gaining those skills. And then the federal funding became tied to standardized test scores. So if you're not doing your job, Michigan, you're not going to get federal money. Well, then if Michigan's not doing their job to get federal funding, then Lakeshore can't get their money. All right? Guys, that's all I have for you today. I'll publish so the only homework you have is to fill in what you don't have and be prepared to come next week for a reading quiz. We'll do a little review before the reading quiz and then take the reading quiz. And then I have an assignment for you to do with your family over Christmas break, so I'm super excited about that. So Allie, I've mentioned it a couple times on Schoology. It'll say a to-do list for today. So if you go to Schoology for, yeah, and so if you open that up, it'll take the link. Well, so if you go to this to-do list for 12/12, and here's the chapter 7 reading notes, and it'll take you right to that. So guys, the reading notes are in this to-do for 12/12. If you open up that to-do, you can see chapter 7 reading notes right here, and it'll take you right back to that. So it's buried in that to-do.
I'm going to have an excuse of absence on Friday because I'm going to take English class.
Yep. Oh, so don't put it as excuse. You need to put that as SR, as school.